Imagine buying a piece of land so forgotten, so neglected, that everyone else had written it off. You poured your time, your savings, and your heart into bringing it back to life, turning ruins into something beautiful again. But just when you thought you finally owned peace, the HOA came knocking. Not to congratulate you, not to thank you. They came to claim everything, insisting your hard work, your property, and even your freedom never truly belonged to you. How far would you go when strangers with clipboards decide your dream isn't yours at all? When Daniel first bought the property by the lake, he wasn't chasing luxury. He wanted peace. Years of living in cramped apartments, surrounded by traffic noise and constant city stress, had worn him down. So when he stumbled across an old, neglected lake at the edge of town, overgrown with weeds, its banks cracked and forgotten, it felt like fate. No one wanted it. But Daniel saw potential where others saw decay. With his own hands, he began restoring it. Weekends were spent clearing brush, hauling debris, and slowly bringing the lake back to life. What had once been a stagnant patch of water started to shimmer again. Birds returned. Fish stirred. Neighbors passing by began to notice the change, nodding in quiet approval as Daniel turned the forgotten land into something beautiful. For the first time in years, he felt proud of the ground beneath his feet. Life seemed simple. Calm mornings by the water. Evenings watching the sun drop across a surface he had revived. But just beyond the surface of that serenity, cracks were forming. A small group of residents, the kind who thrived on rules and control, had started paying closer attention. At first, it was harmless questions. Who gave him permission? Was the lake part of the community? Did he have the right to make changes at all? Daniel didn't know it then, but those whispers were the first ripples of a storm. One that would soon crash down with the full weight of an HOA determined to take what he had built. At first, the questions from neighbors seemed harmless enough. Just casual curiosity about the work Daniel was putting into the old lake. But within weeks, the tone shifted. Notes began to appear on his mailbox, unsigned, filled with clipped phrases like, "You don't have the authority to alter community property," and "The HOA will be in touch." Daniel brushed them off, thinking it was nothing more than idle chatter. After all, the lake wasn't in anyone's care until he stepped in. But he soon learned the hard way that the HOA thrived on claiming control over what they hadn't built. The first official letter arrived in a crisp white envelope, stamped with the HOA's emblem. It demanded he cease all unauthorized activity, and threatened fines if he didn't comply. Fines for what exactly? Clearing trash? Restoring water quality? Planting grass along the bank? The accusations made no sense, but the message was clear. The HOA was drawing a line. Daniel ignored the warning. He had receipts, deeds, and records that showed the land was his. But that didn't stop the next step in their campaign. The HOA began sending inspectors, stern-faced individuals with clipboards, who walked the perimeter of his property like they were appraising stolen goods. They measured fences, photographed every angle, and scribbled notes without ever speaking to him. Neighbors, once friendly, now stood at a distance, whispering as the inspectors came and went. What had been a sanctuary was slowly becoming a stage for a power struggle. Weeks later, the fines started arriving. At first, $100 for unapproved alterations. Then $250 for disturbing community water features. The most insulting? A $500 charge for environmental disruption, because he had dredged out algae that had been choking the lake for decades. Each fine arrived with a demand for immediate payment and a warning that noncompliance could lead to liens against his property. Daniel tried reasoning with them. He attended an HOA meeting, walking into a room filled with neatly arranged chairs and stiff-faced board members staring down from a raised platform. He explained the history of the lake, presented documents proving ownership, and outlined every step of his restoration work. But the board dismissed him with cold, calculated language. Community property cannot be altered without authorization. Ownership is irrelevant when community interests are at stake. It was like speaking to stone. No acknowledgement of his evidence, no recognition of his efforts, just a wall of bureaucratic power. The meeting ended with the HOA president declaring that All further violations will be met with escalating consequences. And escalate they did. Soon, the harassment took new forms. Daniel would wake to find warning signs posted along the edge of the lake. Private work prohibited. His mailbox filled with more fines, each one larger than the last. The HOA even began contacting local agencies, attempting to brand his restoration as an illegal alteration of wetlands. It didn't matter that the land wasn't classified as wetlands, nor that Daniel had checked permits before starting his work. The HOA twisted every technicality into a weapon. The pressure seeped into his daily life. Trips to the store came with sideways glances from neighbors. Some avoided him altogether, while others hinted that maybe he should just let the HOA handle it. The lake, once his retreat, became a constant reminder that he was being watched, judged, and slowly cornered. But Daniel refused to back down. Instead, he doubled his efforts, determined not to let a handful of power-hungry board members erase years of sweat and sacrifice. He expanded the shoreline, added benches, even planted trees to create a park-like feel. Each improvement only seemed to enrage the HOA further, but with every act of defiance, Daniel felt his resolve harden. Then came the letter that changed everything. A formal notice stating that the HOA was claiming ownership of the lake itself. Not just oversight, not just regulation, ownership. According to their interpretation, the lake had always been considered a community feature, and Daniel's deed was irrelevant to communal rights. If he didn't hand over access immediately, they warned, legal action would follow. That was the breaking point. Daniel knew he couldn't ignore them anymore. The stakes had shifted from petty fines to the very question of who the land belonged to. He consulted attorneys, each one confirming what he already knew. The HOA's claim was paper-thin, but their power lay in persistence. They could bury him under endless lawsuits, bleed him dry with fees, and turn the community against him until he had no fight left. The weeks that followed were a blur of threats, notices, and sleepless nights. At one point, Daniel returned home to find HOA representatives standing on his property, measuring and marking boundaries as if preparing to take possession. He forced them off his land, but the message was undeniable. They weren't bluffing. As the legal battle loomed closer, Daniel realized the fight wasn't just about property anymore. It was about control, pride, and the principle of standing your ground when others try to erase your work. With the HOA preparing its case, the community whispering at every turn, and his financial future hanging by a thread, Daniel braced himself for the confrontation that would decide everything. The storm had arrived. The question now was whether he could withstand it, or if the HOA would finally crush him under the weight of their authority. The courtroom was packed tighter than Daniel expected. Neighbors filled the benches, some curious, some eager to watch him fall. At the front sat the HOA board, polished and smug, their attorney flipping through papers with the confidence of someone who had already declared victory. For months, they had bled him with fines, harassed him with inspections, and twisted rules until they claimed ownership of the very lake he had brought back to life. Now, here they were, ready to strip him of everything in front of a judge. Daniel's heart pounded as the HOA's lawyer began. The presentation was cold and rehearsed. The lake has always been understood as a community feature. Regardless of ownership documents, the HOA has maintained implied rights to oversee and regulate this property. Charts and maps were displayed, none showing Daniel's name, only vague outlines of common space. Each word felt like a blade designed to carve away his claim. When it was Daniel's turn, he stood alone. No army of lawyers, no polished presentation. Just folders stuffed with every deed, receipt, and record he could gather. His voice trembled at first, but as he spoke, it grew steadier. He described the state of the lake when he found it. Rotting, neglected, forgotten. He explained the hours of labor, the money poured into restoration, the permits he had checked, the environmental studies he had respected. And then he held up the document that mattered most, his deed. Clear, dated, and indisputable. The courtroom shifted. Whispers spread across the benches. The judge leaned forward, scrutinizing the papers with far more interest than he had shown during the HOA's claims. That's when the HOA's attorney made their fatal mistake. In pressing their argument, they introduced an internal memo, one they likely thought would support their claim of oversight. Instead, it revealed something damning. The HOA had known for years that the lake was not within their jurisdiction. They had debated whether to extend authority, but ultimately admitted, in writing, that the land had been sold off decades earlier. The room erupted. Gasps echoed through the gallery, neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The judge's expression hardened as he read the words aloud. What the HOA had tried to present as rightful governance was exposed as a calculated power grab, one they pursued despite knowing they had no legal standing. Daniel's pulse raced as the judge addressed the board directly. This memo undermines your entire position. You knowingly misrepresented your authority to this homeowner, imposed fines without legal basis, and attempted to claim property that was never yours to govern. The HOA president, once so composed, flushed red under the weight of the judge's words. Their lawyer stammered, scrambling to recover, but the damage was irreversible. The lie had been dragged into the light. Then came the turning point Daniel had dreamed of but hardly dared to expect. The judge declared every fine null and void. He ordered the HOA to cease all claims over the lake and warned of sanctions if further harassment continued. For Daniel, it was vindication. For the board, it was public humiliation. Their authority shattered not behind closed doors, but in front of the very neighbors they had sought to control. As the gavel struck, Daniel felt a wave of relief and exhaustion wash over him. He had stood against an entire system built on intimidation and walked away with his rights intact. But as he looked at the HOA board, faces tight with fury and embarrassment, he knew the battle wasn't over. They had been defeated, yes, but people who thrived on power. But people who thrived on power rarely surrendered quietly. And so the question lingered, heavy in the air. After everything he had endured, would peace finally return to the lake? Or was this only the calm before the next storm? In the days following the court's decision, the neighborhood seemed quieter. The lake, once a battleground of control and power, shimmered as if nothing had ever happened. But beneath that calm surface lay a story everyone in the community had witnessed, one that left its mark far beyond Daniel's property lines. The HOA, stripped of their authority over the lake, retreated into damage control. Their board members avoided eye contact in public, their once confident presence now a shadow of its former self. At the next community meeting, turnout was unusually high. Residents who had once stayed silent now stood up, questioning the board's actions, their spending, and their motives. For the first time, cracks appeared in the wall of control the HOA had built. Some members resigned, their reputations in tatters. Others clung stubbornly to their seats, but their power had been shattered. No longer could they bully, fine, or intimidate without challenge. The exposure of their lies had ignited something deeper in the neighborhood. People realized they didn't have to accept blind control. They had a voice. For Daniel, life slowly returned to the peace he had fought so hard to protect. The mailbox stopped filling with threats. The inspectors stopped circling his property. The warning signs disappeared from the water's edge. What remained was the lake itself, alive, thriving, and untouchable. He poured himself back into its care, not because he needed to prove anything, but because it was his dream. On quiet mornings, he sat on the shore with coffee in hand, watching birds dart across the surface. Each ripple felt like a reminder of resilience, a testament to what happens when someone refuses to be broken by unjust power. He knew the battle had cost him time, money, and sleepless nights, but in the end, he had reclaimed more than land, he had reclaimed dignity. Neighbors began stopping by, some to apologize, others to congratulate him. A few admitted they had doubted him, afraid of crossing the HOA, but now they admired the stand he had taken. Slowly, what had been isolation became connection. The lake transformed into more than just Daniel's project. It became a symbol of standing your ground. Still, not every scar faded. The memory of harassment lingered. Even years later, the sight of a white envelope in the mailbox could stir a flicker of unease. The HOA, though weakened, never truly disappeared. Their authority in other areas remained, and though they no longer dared to challenge him directly, Daniel understood the truth. People who crave control rarely let go completely. But he also learned something powerful. Bullies, no matter how organized or official they appear, crumble when exposed to light. His victory wasn't just about a lake. It was about showing that no one, not even a board with rules and titles, could erase hard work, ownership, and perseverance. The long-term impact stretched far beyond Daniel's property. The community began pushing back against needless rules, questioning the validity of fines, and demanding transparency. Where once the HOA's word had been law, now it faced scrutiny at every turn. The board that once intimidated everyone was now forced to answer for itself. And as for Daniel, he continued to live quietly by his lake, caring for it season after season. In summer, children from the neighborhood came to fish along its banks. In fall, families walked the paths he had carved, marveling at the colors reflected on the water. Even in winter, when ice formed a glassy surface, the lake stood as a reminder of resilience. He never forgot the fight, but he no longer lived in its shadow. Instead, he lived in its lesson. Because here's the truth. When someone tries to take what's yours, when they use rules and power to break you down, you have a choice. You can surrender or you can stand. Daniel stood. And because he did, his story became more than just a battle with an HOA. It became a reminder to every homeowner, every neighbor, every person watching. You don't have to accept injustice, even when it comes in the form of fine print and clipboards. So the next time an HOA, a neighbor, or anyone else tells you that your hard work, your dream, or your home doesn't belong to you, ask yourself this. Will you let them take it? Or will you stand your ground and fight for what's rightfully yours? Because sometimes, the fight for peace is the only way to truly earn it.